Hello, I'm Father Ryan O'Neill from Greeley, Colorado, and I would like to dive into the Gospel reading for the fifth Sunday of Lent. And that's taken from the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John. And whenever I pray about this reading, I always have the image of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ comes back to my mind. It's such a powerful image with the woman reaching out to Christ's foot and the scribes and Pharisees dropping their stones and then turning around and walking away. And there's this kind of this romantic, artistic quality to the story. But today I would really like to look at the biblical quality of this story. The biblical connections and the biblical art that we see going on here that John in chapter 8 is employing. So first of all, we begin with Jesus sitting on a mountain, the Mount of Olives, and then transferring to Mount Zion. Now, it doesn't say Mount Zion specifically in the chapter, but it says the temple in Jerusalem. And we know that the temple was built on Mount Zion. So we see Jesus transferring from the Mount of Olives in prayer, moving over to Mount Zion. And normally, in the Bible, mountains are a place where men encounter God and where God comes down to encounter men. So we have this God-man, this man-God, Jesus Christ, sitting on top of mountains and probably hearkening back to our minds images from other previous encounters with God on the mountain, such as Mount Sinai with the theophany. But before we move into that image, there's another subtle idea that I'd like to just bring forward. And Thomas Aquinas and the Dominicans often talk about praying first and receiving from God, receiving wisdom, inspiration, and then teaching. So meditation and then teaching and preaching, as the Dominican order, as Thomas Aquinas would often say. So first you must receive, then you can give. So this is exactly what we see Jesus doing. He spends time in prayer on the Mount of Olives, encountering God on top of this mountain, and then he goes to the temple in Jerusalem, it says. He sits down and he begins to teach. So he receives and then he gives away what he receives from his Father in prayer. And then it says all the people started coming to him. That's what it says in the gospel. The people began to come to him. And he sat down and he taught them. This is reminiscent of, again, Mount Sinai in the story of the Exodus, when the people were gathered to the mountain. They were gathered to the mountain of God, not just for worship, but also for worship, but to have the encounter with the Lord, to have an encounter with God. And there was the cloud and the thunderbolts and the trumpets, and there were the angels. And then Moses ascended the mountain to have this encounter with God. So we have this echo, very faint but still present, an echo of Moses. We have this echo of Moses on Mount Sinai, Jesus on Mount Zion. Both of them were teachers. Moses is one of the greatest teachers in the history of Israel. Moses is also considered the greatest judge in the history of Israel. Both of those are important here for this reading. Moses the teacher, Moses the judge. Also keep in mind that John, the Gospel of John, is similar to the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but he's also much more mystical in the way he portrays the same events in the life of Christ. And I would propose that this chapter, the chapter of the adulterous woman and Jesus, is John's version of the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 8, Matthew literally has Jesus sitting down and teaching like the new Moses. He says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And then he gives them the new law. Now, John doesn't have anything like that. John has chapter 8, where Jesus sits down in the temple area and he begins to teach. And he begins to teach. And, as we see, he also judges. So he's portraying Jesus as a new Moses here. a new Moses. In the ancient world, it was the custom that a teacher would sit down to teach, and the students would stand up. So we see Jesus taking the position of a teacher. And we also see how people are irresistibly attracted to Jesus. They come to him. There's no explanation. They come to him, and then he begins to teach, almost as if he's a magnet. And then that just brings a question to my mind. Are you attracted to Christ? Are you fascinated with him? Are we drawn to him in our thoughts, with our free time? Do we want to spend time getting to know Jesus? Because there were a lot of people in the Bible who were irresistibly drawn to him. So then the scribes and Pharisees, they bring to him the case of a woman caught in adultery. And this case in the law of Moses would require that the woman be stoned to death. So they bring this case before the judge, Jesus. If he's setting himself up as the new Moses, they're going to treat him like Moses. And they're going to bring judicial cases before him. And this woman has been caught. But it says that they did this to test him. John says that. It's interesting. The scribes and the Pharisees are testing Jesus, who is himself the Son of God. And that's always a bad place to put yourself spiritually. Why? Why? Because, you see, it's God who tests us, right? We don't test God. And anytime we put God to the test, we're probably not in a very good spiritual place. So we can automatically tell that this is not going to turn out well for the scribes and Pharisees, who are putting themselves in the place of God to test Jesus, instead of allowing God to test them. So how does Jesus respond to this? Well, in their hearts, do they really want to stone the woman caught in adultery, or do they want to catch Jesus? In reality, their murderous desire is not towards the adulterous woman, but towards Jesus Christ himself. So Jesus responds by bending down, it says, and writing on the ground with his finger. Notice the details. Writing on the ground with his finger. You might say, okay, what? No big deal. He didn't have a pencil, or he didn't have a stick to write with. No, but if we remember Mount Sinai, God coming down and meeting Moses on the mountain, what did God give to Moses? That's right, the 10 Commandments. And it says in the Exodus, the book of Exodus, that God himself wrote on the stone tablets the 10 Commandments. So we have Jesus, who's being tested by the scribes and Pharisees, then begins to act as God himself. He begins to act as God does, and he writes on the ground. He writes like God wrote the 10 Commandments on the 10 Commandments on the stone tablets. So Jesus is not telling us that he's God. He's showing us that he's God, and that is beautiful. Do we have the eyes to see it? Because sometimes we'd rather have somebody tell us, just tell me, okay? But in the Bible, especially John's Gospel, they show us more than they tell us. And so we have to be attentive to those details. So Jesus, also very important to notice the detail of bending down. Bending down. Jesus bends down to write. Almost as if God is condescending, coming down from heaven to earth to encounter mankind in the incarnation. And then in his humanity, what does it say? Jesus straightens up to listen to them. And so we have this upward motion and this downward motion of God and man in Jesus Christ himself, in his person, God and man being reconciled, bending down and straightening up. So what I propose we see here is a rewriting of the original law, the original covenant that God made with Moses and the Israelites on Mount Sinai. It's a reestablishment, because we all know about the golden calf incident. We know that the law was destroyed. Moses literally broke the 10 Commandments, and they had to write a ton of more other commandments to make up for that. And so Jesus is reestablishing the 10 Commandments as a firm foundation for the moral life. But then, does he stay there? Does he simply stay at the old covenant with the law of justice, with the law of blessing and curses? No, he doesn't. What does he do? He moves beyond it in mercy. This is what he does. He has come not just to reestablish the old covenant, but to use it as a launch pad to move into the new covenant. And with a new covenant comes a new law, a law based off of mercy, not justice. And that's why he says, "Let the one among you who is without sin cast the first stone." And I think it's important that we reflect on the relationship between mercy and justice here. And I'll take a tip from Pope John Paul II when he talks about faith and reason. Let's make an analog, a parallel argument. John Paul II would say that faith is not a lack of reason. Faith is not less than reason. Faith itself goes beyond reason. It gives us access to knowledge that reason itself cannot know. But faith itself is reasonable. That once we know this inaccessible knowledge through revelation, through the scriptures, through the tradition of the church, we can apply our reason to it and it still makes sense. It's reasonable. But faith goes beyond reason. The same with mercy. Mercy is not a lack of justice. It's not less than justice. It goes beyond justice. It enters into a new law, a new realm of justice. And it brings us into the eternal law of God. It goes beyond the limited lawfulness and understanding of law, of humanity and mankind and creation. And it goes beyond into a broader horizon, into a new world, a new life where forgiveness is the path to freedom. And it's really the realm of God's love. The realm of God's love encountering us as sinners. Our world wants to say that there's no such thing as sin. And that's what this gospel is about. Jesus is just saying, doesn't matter what you did, doesn't matter how bad it is, sin doesn't really matter. I'm Jesus. It's okay. Just be who you are, do what you want to do. I still love you. I'm Jesus. And a lot of people might in our world today interpret the gospel this way. But I would say no. I would say that's not what's happening, because that's not mercy. Mercy does not ignore sin or overlook sin. Mercy actually acknowledges that sin is real and bad. But then it moves beyond justice. Instead of giving the person what they deserve because of their sin, it's an application of divine love on the wound of our sin. That's what's happening here. That's what's happening here. So, is the church open to everybody? Does the church welcome everybody? Yes. Yes, the church is. The church is open to the whole world. We want everybody to be in the church. But if you're going to come into the church, you come into the church on Jesus' terms. You don't come into the church on your terms. You come into the church on Jesus' terms, which is why he says at the end of this reading, "Go and do not sin anymore." Oh, so there is an expectation. There are terms that Jesus has imposed upon this woman. Although he has encountered her with mercy, there's an expectation that if she is going to follow him, that she will not sin anymore. So I think it's helpful for us to step back from our maybe typical reading of this gospel and say, oh, it's just a story of forgiveness. It is. It's a story of forgiveness, but it's also an invitation to begin to look at our life now. And how do you interpret your own guilt? How do you relate to God with your own shame? Are you still relating to him as an Old Testament person, expecting blessings and curses because of your own guilt, because of your own faults? Or are you relating to God? Are you relating to Jesus Christ as an invitation to enter into that life beyond justice, that life beyond the blessings and the curses of the Old Testament? Basically, are we living our life out of fear of punishment? Or are we living our life as an invitation to love? To accept that invitation and to realize that God is love and mercy is the doorway into that love. That's a beautiful, beautiful meditation this year during the year of mercy, especially in the middle of Lent, when some of us may be growing weary from our penances, to know that God himself wants to bring you into a new realm. He wants to take your religious life, your spiritual life to a new level, based off of the Ten Commandments, but then going beyond the Ten Commandments and bringing you into a mystical, loving relationship with your Father in heaven who loves you. Thank you. God bless.